Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the American Revolution Part 1, The Road to Rebellion by Epic History. So I'm very excited to jump into this series, right? As y'all know, I'm a big fan of the Age of Revolutions, and on this channel, we've covered the French Revolution, a lot actually. We've covered the Haitian Revolution, now it's time for the American Revolution. And of course, Epic History always does a fantastic job whatever topic they're covering, so I'm sure this will be a good one. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and I'll give you access to exclusive content. Now, with all that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
1763. The 7 Years' War, a global conflict fought by European powers, is at an end, and the British Empire has emerged victorious. Dominating its French and Spanish rivals, it claims new territory in India, the West Indies, and above all, North America.
Yeah.
France must accept the loss of nearly all its colonies. 3 million square miles of land, comparable in size to all Europe.
Yeah, the 7 Years' War is really the perfect place to start this series. Now, I honestly think it's difficult to overstate how important the 7 Years' War was to sort of global history, right? Whether you were a winner or a loser of this conflict, it really shakes things up. And I'm not just talking about the territorial changes. Now, those are obviously important too. Britain gains all this new territory. France, in particular, loses a lot of territory. But what's probably even more important than that is that this war is extremely expensive. Every power involved, once again, whether they won or lost or were somewhere in the middle, they had to take on massive loans, debts, in order to pay for this conflict. Now, when the war ends, what that means is now they need to pay off those debts. And countries are going to find a lot of different ways of doing that, and it's going to affect some more than others, but it will really affect every country that was involved in the conflict. And for some of them, it's going to lead into this age of revolutions, right? That's why I say this is a perfect place to start this story. You can pretty see, and I'm sure we will see, how it pretty directly leads into the American Revolution, but also this chain of events will spiral into the French Revolution in the case of France, which sort of spirals into the Haitian Revolution, and a whole host of other events. So the 7 Years' War is really, in many ways, this sort of turning point where a lot begins to change, and the sort of cogs of history really begin to move, and it'll lead to a lot of these big events and changes down the line.
The British now rule an empire on which the sun never sets.
Right.
But in victory, the seeds of future conflict are sown.
Exactly. Now, I will say, in the immediate aftermath of the 7 Years' War, you probably would not have been able to predict that Britain's empire was going to take such a hit. However, even with the hit of the American Revolution, which does shake up British imperial policy, it does cause them to focus in different areas. Even with that, the British Empire is still on the up and up. Obviously, at this point, we're still sort of at the very beginning of British imperial ascendancy, right? They will create this empire that truly conquers the world. So we're both at the beginning of that, but right at that beginning, we are going to see a bit of a road bump for the Brits.
The enormous cost of the war has ballooned Britain's national debt.
Yeah.
Interest payments alone consume more than half its annual spending.
Jesus. That's pretty extreme. Now, once again, it was not just Britain. You can look about, just about any country that was involved with this conflict. In the aftermath, a lot of them are going to try new forms of taxation, reforms, and a lot of those will cause unrest, dissatisfaction. Sometimes those will lead directly to revolutions, sometimes not a revolution, but, still some problems. This is the case for a lot of countries, and it's not even the worst for the Brits. Obviously, France sort of gets it the worst, right? Because they are the loser of this conflict. They lose a lot of territory. France was already in a pretty bad financial situation. This sort of sinks them even further. Not to mention that the American Revolution will cost France a lot more money as well as they get involved. So they're in a lot of trouble. But so is Britain. They have sunk a lot of money into this conflict. They need to figure out how to make some of that cash back.
And the vast new territories in America will need defending from bitter imperial rivals who will look for any chance to reverse Britain's gains.
Oh yeah.
Native American tribes also pose a threat, especially those that are former allies of the French. In 1763, Chief Pontiac of the Odawa leads a revolt against the British. There is bloodshed along the frontier as every British fort west of the Appalachians comes under attack.
Yeah, this is a big moment in colonial American history, and we'll see a series of these conflicts that have really been taking place since these Europeans, in this case we're talking mainly about British settlers, first arrived. You'll see a series of conflicts with the indigenous people as these European settlers keep pushing further and further westwards.
But the greatest challenge will come not from external enemies,
Yep.
but from the very colonies Britain seeks to protect.
The American Revolution, Part 1. What then is the American, this new man? He is an American who, leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced. From letters from an American farmer. We've got starting off with a very important text here. Now, this is an interesting question, right? We sort of get to this idea of American identity. Because, of course, at this point, in the immediate aftermath of the 7 Years' War, all the people in these colonies still would have primarily identified themselves as British colonists, right? That's how they saw themselves. They saw themselves in this British tradition. Well, as this series goes on, we'll see that begin to shift as people embrace a new American identity. But this is sort of a slow process, and it's not what everyone jumps to immediately. The second there's some dissatisfaction, it's not like everyone is up in arms. No, people see themselves as British, and these colonists try to sort things out politically, but of course that is not going to work in the end.
157 years have passed since the first British colony was founded in North America. Now, there are 26 British colonies in North America
First permanent settlement.
and the West Indies. 13 of these lie along America's eastern seaboard, where after years of prosperity and immigration, the population has passed 2 million.
Yeah.
Arguably, there is more that divides these 13 colonies than unites them. Each has its own distinct character, history, and form of government.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot separating these different colonies, and sort of a part of this American Revolution, or the build-up to this American Revolution, will be bringing all these colonies together. Someone who plays a big role in that is Benjamin Franklin. We sort of just saw a reference to. Now, we'll talk about some of that, but the truth is, there's a lot of differences between these colonies, and though, there may be some unified identity as sort of colonials, the main unified identity is of British subjects, right? And they share that with the rest of the subjects of the British Empire. So they're not held incredibly close together, at least not at this point. Now, once again, that is going to change. But right now, there's a lot separating them. Way of life, economy, the question of slavery, which is key to both of those things, right? There's a lot that these colonies have different. Politics, religion, I mean, you can really go down the list. There's quite a difference between all these colonies.
Several were founded by those seeking religious freedom in the New World. the Puritans who settled Massachusetts.
Yeah, though I always have a bit of a quibble with that explanation of the Puritans. There's this sort of myth that, or maybe I shouldn't call it a myth, there's this idea that the poor Puritans who found themselves so oppressed were forced to flee to America to make these communities of religious freedom for themselves. This is a very propagandized version of events. Really, what happens is the Puritans are this extremely intolerant religious community. What they want is to live in this society of their own making that is actually not tolerant at all, has extreme religious intolerance. They want things to be exactly the way they imagine them. Now, they can't really do that in Britain. They find they can't do it in the Netherlands, and so what they do is they come to the colonies, and they come to America, and they find that here they are much better able to make this sort of community they've always imagined. So, I do have a quibble with that explanation of things. However, there are examples of a lot of people coming to the colonies for the sake of religious freedom. I think Pennsylvania, now I'm very biased because I'm a Pennsylvanian, is a much better example of that, right? William Penn shows up, a Quaker sets up this Quaker colony, which truly does have religious toleration at the root of it, right? He's not setting up this colony that's only for Quakers. No, he actually embraces religious toleration in a way that is pretty radical for that time. So there are definitely examples of people who are coming because they've been persecuted and they're seeking that religious freedom. And sometimes those people even are Puritans, but often that was not exactly the case.
The Catholics of Maryland and Quakers of Pennsylvania.
There we go.
Each colony has its share of rugged pioneers and economic opportunists, enticed by promises of plentiful land. But there are also many who arrive destitute, desperate, or against their will.
Well, right.
Slavery is legal in all 13 colonies.
And we have the breakdown here, so you can sort of see the prevalence of slavery in these different colonies, right? And we're at the point where you can see slavery in all these different colonies, but it's just more or less prevalent depending on where you look. It's more or less a big part of the economy, right? So we can look at New Hampshire right at the top. Got a free population of about 61,000 and a slave population of 650, right? So that's heavily weighted towards the free population. But if we look at some of these middle colonies, or especially these southern colonies, you'll see a colony like Maryland, for example, about 140K people, free people, with 63, almost 64,000 enslaved people. You can see Virginia, about 260K free people, 187K enslaved people, right? And actually, the most extreme example of this is going to be down in South Carolina. About 49,000 free people with 75,000 enslaved people, right? So at this point, the enslaved population actually significantly outnumbers the free population. And this is from 1770. So what you're seeing here is there is slavery throughout the colonies, but it is far more prominent in some places than others, and it tends to be a far smaller part of the economy in New England and in the North, though it still exists, right?
In the North, enslaved Africans are a small minority, about 5% of the population. But in the South, the economy is dominated by slave plantations that grow rice, tobacco, and indigo. In Virginia, African slaves make up around 40% of the population.
Yeah.
In South Carolina, 60%.
Extreme.
Early settlers.
Although we recently talked about the Haitian Revolution, and in the colony of Saint-Domingue, which was one of, if not the most brutal slave colonies, their population was 90% enslaved and 10% free. So you can see how extreme Saint-Domingue was if we compare it to even the most sort of slave-prevalent colonies in the American mainland. Have got 60% of their population enslaved, which is a lot, by the way, but it's not 90%.
Had been overwhelmingly from England. But in recent decades, the picture has begun to change. with more immigrants from Ireland, Scotland, and Germany. All have helped to shape a new American culture, which makes a sharp impression on visitors. It is less deferential, more enterprising, increasingly self-confident.
Yeah, this is the thing. Like I said, at this point, we're talking in the immediate aftermath of the 7 Years' War. The vast majority of people here still consider themselves British subjects. However, that doesn't mean that a new culture hasn't been developing. Now, this new culture is pretty diverse in itself, right? It depends. Are you looking at the North, the South? Are you looking at the coast or the frontier? Or, are you looking urban or rural? You'll find a lot of diversity throughout these different places, but you do find, right, because at this point, like I said, there's not a super unified American identity, though that will form, but we do find these new types of cultures emerging that are sort of different from what you might find back in Britain, right? They may identify themselves, these people, as British subjects, but they may have their different way of life and a different culture.
Old ties with the motherland are not what they used to be. For most of their history, the relationship between the British government and its American colonies has been one of salutary neglect. The colonies had been largely left to manage their own affairs.
Yeah, and there have been a couple of exceptions to this, a couple of moments when the government, for example, under Cromwell, has tried to take stronger control of the colonies, but largely salutary neglect has been the policy, which simply means that the colonies have mainly been left to their own affairs, right? The British Empire, the British government, it's got this sort of system going, where the purpose of these colonies primarily is to produce goods that the sort of slave colonies of Britain, both in the south of the mainland, but primarily in the Caribbean, can use so they can keep producing cash crops, right? That's the role of these American colonies, to provide food and goods to keep these slave colonies going. That's sort of the system the British Empire has set up, right? So who's really making the money? Well, it's not, Massachusetts. It's these Caribbean colonies. It's Barbados. It's Jamaica. They're making the real money, right? And so the British government essentially is like, look, you play your role, these 13 colonies, these American mainland colonies, and if you play your role, you can sort of take care of your own devices, all right? Do whatever you want to do. But we don't need to rule over you that directly. And that has mostly been how things have worked.
While Britain focused on more lucrative possessions in the West Indies and India.
Exactly.
But this is about to change.
Exactly.
Britain faces an extraordinary debt crisis.
Oh yeah.
And many expect the colonies to help meet the cost of their own defense. It seems a reasonable expectation. The average American's tax burden is a fraction of that paid by the average Briton. By one calculation, a Briton pays 26 shillings a year in tax. A New Englander, 1 shilling. But it is the manner in which the British government goes about raising taxes.
Yeah, so there's this situation in which these American colonists are not paying nearly as much tax. And so you might think, well, if we just raise their tax a bit, we should be fine. Why would this lead to any sort of unrest or uprising? Well, there's a couple of things here. First, we gotta remember, people live their lives in a pretty relative manner. So even if I'm paying way less than you, if I get what seems like a massive tax hike to me, well, relatively, I'm gonna be pretty upset. But more than that, it's more sort of the principle of it, right? The fact that these colonists, who have been primarily left to their own devices, feel like this British government is suddenly coming in out of nowhere and imposing this legislation on them, which was not something they typically had to deal with. So it feels pretty tyrannical from the beginning. And then the sort of main part of this, and this will become a rallying cry, is the idea of no taxation without representation, right? The main rallying cry will be, well, we do not have representation in the parliament. And so how are you going to levy taxes on us if we have no representation in the government? It doesn't seem right to people. right? So these are some of the reasons why these American colonists get upset, even though the people back in Britain proper are paying a lot more taxes.
that will put it and the colonies on a collision course.
If America looks to Great Britain for protection, she must enable us to protect her. If she expects our fleets, she must assist our revenue. From Edmund Burke, of course, a very prominent British politician and writer of this era, will really be one of the sort of foundational figures of modern conservatism. We're going to see, and I hope we cover a lot of this politics, but we're going to see a sort of breakdown in the British Parliament where you'll have factions, a lot of different factions, sort of varying between those who want to assert themselves most directly on the colonies, and they don't care what the colonists say, to those who are actually very sympathetic with the colonists, right? You'll have members of the British Parliament who essentially agree with the cause of the colonists, right? So you have this very interesting political situation.
British Prime Minister George Grenville is determined to fix the country's spiralling debt crisis. He believes new colonial taxes must be part of the solution. In 1764, he proposes two new revenue-raising measures. A Sugar Act, which actually lowers the tax on foreign sugar and molasses, but only as part of a determined effort to ensure more effective collection.
Yeah, this is the thing where sometimes you have to see beyond the explicit text of an act, right? Because really what's happening here is that the British Parliament is saying, all right, we're finally going to enforce our own damn policies. We've left you to do whatever you wanted for decades and decades and decades. We're finally going to step in and we're going to assert our authority, right? And of course, this was a big part, as you can imagine, of that change with the 7 Years' War, Now, of course, sort of reason this is happening is because Britain needs more revenue, and that's all because of the 7 Years' War. But additionally, the 7 Years' War meant a lot more direct intervention from the British government, right? Sending a lot more troops, a lot more officials, people who were directly on the ground. And so this war was sort of a moment when, the British government was able to get a lot more directly involved in their colonies. And this is sort of jumping off of that.
And a Stamp Act, which will tax all commercial and legal documents, from newspapers and playing cards to attorneys' licenses and land grants. These relatively minor taxes are not expected to cause much fuss. Englishmen have been paying them for 70 years. But to the surprise of the British government, the reaction in the colonies is uproar.
Yep.
The Stamp Act particularly hits merchants, lawyers and business owners, the most articulate and influential members of colonial society. They condemn the measures in newspapers and a flood of pamphlets.
This tax will deprive us of all our invaluable rights and privileges. It will drain us suddenly of our cash, occasion an entire stagnation of trade, discourage every kind of industry, and involve us in the most abject slavery.
Opposition focuses less on the financial burden than on the principle of consent.
Right.
Americans protest that they have no representation in the British Parliament.
And there's a lot to be said here about the ideological tradition within which these figures are operating, right? Remember, at this moment, we may be calling them Americans, but that's not really a thing yet. I mean, there's the idea of someone who's sort of an American colonial, but that's a British subject. So these people still see themselves as Brits and within this British political tradition. And so, especially at this point, but throughout the Revolution, what you see are people referencing back to British political tradition. They see themselves as operating within this liberal, radical British tradition that maybe saw its greatest expression in the Civil War, this whole era of British history, right? Now, it's sort of interesting to see that because they're really drawing on this British tradition of political liberty and political consent and representation of the people and all this sort of stuff. And they're saying, hey, this is our tradition, and so why are we not being represented in the parliament? And so this is not some outside slate of ideas. These dissenting figures are drawing on a British tradition of dissent.
And can accept no taxation without representation. It is their rights as British subjects, they point out, rights protected by the British Constitution, that are being trampled on.
Exactly.
Prime Minister George Grenville argues the American colonies have virtual representation in Parliament. That is, their interests are represented in a general way by all British MPs. After all, even most Britons don't have the right to vote in a general election. Grenville's argument does not win many backers, even in Parliament itself, where electoral reform is a fierce battleground.
Right. Like I said, you'll find different opinions in Parliament. Some people very sympathetic to the cause of the Americans. And also remember, the American Revolution, though of course it is sort of a class coalition, you will see people from different classes who involve themselves and become patriots. And even the leadership will have people from different classes. However, the majority of people we're going to be talking about in the sort of leadership class of the revolution, we're often talking about quite elite individuals, whether we're talking about the plantation-owning elite of the South or the merchant elite of the North. There are some more middling upper-class individuals who are involved. But these are people who absolutely feel themselves entitled to direct political representation, and they're pretty outraged that all of this is being put on them without their consent.
There is an idea, in some, that the colonies are virtually represented in the House. I would fain know by whom an American is represented here. Is he represented by any knight of the Shire in any county in this kingdom? Or will you tell him that he is represented by any representative of a borough? A borough which perhaps its own representatives never saw. This is what is called the rotten part of the Constitution.
Yeah.
It cannot continue a century.
The Speaker is...
Well, it actually did continue for decades and decades, until the 1830s. But what they're pointing out here is that even in Britain proper, there are people who are not satisfied with this system of representation. And this will remain an issue for decades and decades and decades until there's a big reform in the 1830s. But that's still a long time away from here. But we see that you have some people who are saying, yeah, well, the Americans definitely aren't represented. I mean, a lot of us Brits aren't even represented.
Pitt the Elder, a renowned former Prime Minister, who adds
that this kingdom has no right to lay a tax upon the colonies.
What greater glory can New England see than stamp men hanging from a tree? Oh, man. That's quite a line.
Throughout 1765, colonial assemblies meet to protest against the new acts. In the Virginia House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry emerges as one of the most radical leaders of colonial resistance. He proposes a series of resolutions which are adopted by the House.
Resolved, that the first adventurers and settlers of His Majesty's colony and dominion of Virginia brought with them all the liberties, privileges, and immunity.
I will say, it's sort of funny that we've got this, American voice reading this, because of course, at this point, everyone involved in this story would have all had old-timey English accents, which no one really wants to do, but it's sort of funny to see that sort of modern take on it, I guess.
That have at any time been held, enjoyed, and possessed by the people of Great Britain. Resolved, that the taxation of the people by themselves, or by persons chosen by themselves to represent them, is the only security against a burdensome taxation.
I mean, once again, remember, all of this is within British tradition. all of this is very John Locke. You know what I mean? This is all that British tradition of freedom and liberty, which is now being taken up by these American colonists who are saying, hey, wait a minute. What about John Locke? What about all these ideas? Are we not supposed to embrace these? Are these not part of our political tradition? You know, have we forgotten about this?
But there are bitter divisions within the Virginia Assembly. Some members believe Patrick Henry goes too far. Loyalty to Britain and the British Crown is deep-rooted.
Yeah.
Conservative members succeed in removing his most radical resolution, that only Virginia's assembly has the authority to raise taxes in the colony.
Right. And once again, at this point, someone like a Patrick Henry was seen as quite a radical, especially in the southern colonies. You still have, not just in the South, but throughout the colonies, a lot of allegiance to the British Parliament, to the British Crown in particular. These are all good, upstanding British subjects. Of course, they have loyalty to the Crown. And so this type of radicalism is still sort of niche. Now, it will be slowly on the rise, but this is not the most popular strain of thought at this point.
Among the regular observers of these debates, a brilliant 22-year-old law clerk named Thomas Jefferson. The divisions in Virginia are mirrored across the colonies.
Yep.
As debate grows more heated and protests turn violent. Tax collectors are beaten up by mobs, driven out of town, or forced to resign. Tax documents are destroyed.
And really, at the best of times, tax collectors have never been a very popular group of people. You know what I mean? We've got many examples throughout history of tax collectors being beaten or chased out of towns or whatever. So these are already not very liked individuals. And now that there's this, very open political element to it, tax collectors, they're in danger, basically.
Effigies of royal governors are burned or hanged from liberty trees. Meanwhile, delegates from 9 of the 13 colonies meet in New York, where they draft a petition to the British King, George III,
And by the way, this sort of thing is a big moment, right? Because we've talked about that there's not, in many ways, a whole lot uniting these colonies. They're all quite different. Though there is an idea of an American, it's not any sort of national identity, right? It's more a sort of geographical descriptor, though it's becoming a certain type of identity. And so, having a lot of these colonies come together in these congresses, and we'll see a series of these congresses, is a big way in which everyone starts to come together. It's like, well, New Jersey has got its issues, so is Pennsylvania, so is Massachusetts, so is Connecticut, etc., etc. But instead of taking all these issues on individually, they start to say, hey, wait a minute, what if we all got together and worked in unison? And, you can sort of see here they're building towards something much bigger.
Parliament. While assuring Crown and Parliament of their unwavering loyalty, the delegates declare that it is their right, as Englishmen, to have no taxes imposed upon them without their consent.
Right.
Colonial merchants begin to organize a boycott of British goods. The uproar, the possible damage to trade, plus the fact that taxes are clearly unenforceable, finally forces the British government to back down.
Yeah. And this is sort of a theme we'll see repeatedly until, finally the Parliament's like, no, we have to assert ourselves. Because remember, we've had this era of salutary neglect. The British Parliament is like, look, just perform your role in our economic system and we'll leave you alone. So now they're trying to come in with these taxes. They try it, it doesn't work. They say, fine, we'll back down. And we'll see this process sort of repeated a couple of times before the tension just gets too high.
The following year, 1766, the Sugar Act and Stamp Act are scrapped by a new British Prime Minister, Lord Rockingham. the colonies have won a major victory. But the British Parliament does not back down over its right to raise taxes in America.
Right. And the thing is, when you have an issue like this, sometimes you can get what you want, which is these taxes repealed, but by the end, it's almost not enough, right? And that's actually true for both sides here, right? The British Parliament has been forced to back down, right? So they have not gotten what they wanted, and they still maintain their right to unilaterally impose taxes on the American colonies, right? Without representation. Whereas the American colonists, sure, they sort of got what they wanted here, these taxes repealed, though there will be more in the future. But even in this moment, you have some people who are like, now wait a minute, now we got these taxes repealed, which is what we wanted, but we haven't really addressed the key issue, which is, we're having all this stuff imposed on us, and we don't have representation. That's still a problem. And so people are now sort of ginned up, they're ready to go. And so when the next battle comes, well, at this moment, still only a political battle, people are going to be ready and raring to go.
The same day it repeals the taxes, it declares,
Parliament assembled had, hath, and of right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America, in all cases whatsoever.
Right.
The words seem calculated to outrage America's colonial assemblies and convince many that though this storm has passed, another will surely follow.
Suppose a military force is sent into America. They will not find a rebellion. They may indeed make one. Very prescient. From Benjamin Franklin. Very prescient, right? So what he's saying here is, look, you send in a military force, you are going to provoke the very rebellion you're trying to avoid. People are already up in arms about how these taxes are being imposed without representation. If you send a standing army over the ocean, it's only going to make you look more authoritarian, which people really don't like. And at this point, Benjamin Franklin, he's the rare figure at this point who is both known, in the Americas and known back in Europe, right? He's this sort of transatlantic figure, probably the first really famous American, right? If we want to talk about American in that sense. And in fact, Benjamin Franklin plays a big role in sort of defining what an American is. A lot of these values, ideas associated with being an American, Benjamin Franklin lays a lot of that out. I mean, there's a lot that could be said about that. Basically, very influential figure, this American, who, by the way, is pretty early to the game of American identity. Once again, Franklin will play a big role in bringing people together, who is still important and well-known back in Europe, and sort of plays the role of, well, later an official, but at this point, sort of an unofficial representative back in Britain. He says, hey, as the #1 American, you should listen to me when I tell you this is a bad idea. And he'll sort of play this role in France when America's looking, or the colonies are looking for help from France. He'll go as sort of America's representative, saying, hey guys, as the #1 American, give me some money,
1767. 1 year on, Parliament passes a new series of measures to raise revenue from the colonies and demonstrate its authority over them.
Uh-oh.
They are named after the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Townshend Acts. In the 13 colonies, they are met with howls of protest.
Yep.
Royal administrators are chased out of towns. Some tax officials are tarred and feathered, a brutal punishment where the victim is paraded through the streets covered in scalding tar.
Yeah, it's brutal.
A new term emerges for these rabble-rousers: patriots.
Yeah. So something else I'm going to point out is that another part of this that's making people mad, right? We talked about how there was this era of salutary neglect, and the colonies were basically being left to their own affairs. Well, during that period of time, there's been a lot of smuggling, right? Britain still sort of has this mercantilist policy where they have that system of trade I sort of laid out, where everything really goes back to the motherland, the metropole, Britain, in the end. But you've got this system between Britain and the mainland colonies and the Caribbean colonies, and they're all meant to be supporting each other, and they're not meant to be interacting with, say, French colonies or Spanish colonies. Well, when Britain's not really enforcing its own policies, what do you think happens? These American colonists do a lot of smuggling with the Spanish and the French and the Dutch and etc., etc. So, when all this starts happening, and Britain's trying to enforce its authority, one thing they want to do is crack down on smuggling. And everyone's like, hey, what are you doing? This is like our way of life. We've been doing this for like more than 100 years. So that's sort of another thing. You can stack it on top of the others, where basically these colonists have set out their own way of life with basically, in many ways, the absence of direct British rule. With the 7 Years' War, the British Parliament really comes in, and they want to shake things up. They want to rule directly. And these people are like, whoa, wait a minute, we've kind of got a thing going on here.
Colonists who seek to avoid confrontation with Parliament become known as loyalists. Many communities,
Sometimes called Tories.
and even families, will soon be divided between these two camps. Though for now, most are somewhere in the middle. Among the patriots in New England are a group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty. Led by Samuel Adams, they include merchant and smuggler John Hancock,
Was I not just talking about smuggling?
physician
Often at this time, merchant slash smuggler might as well have been the same thing, right? Frankly, if you were a colonial merchant, you were probably also a smuggler. Not always, but a lot of the time.
Joseph Warren, and silversmith Paul Revere. The Christ.
And I will say, I talked earlier about the class dynamic here, how you have a lot of these sort of elites involved. Now, that's not, like, entirely the case. As the revolution, and we're not quite, well, there's sort of a debate over whether the American Revolution is just the war, or is it this whole thing? Is this whole thing the American Revolution? But I'm sort of using it more broadly. The revolution here, as it goes on, will bring more people in. It'll become more of a cross-class coalition. But I will say, especially sort of in the middle colonies and up here in New England, though you do see the involvement of this sort of merchant elite, there's also a lot of this sort of middle-class type individual who may be a merchant or a tradesman of some kind. You know, they may be more or less successful. We're talking about a range of people, and from the beginning, especially up here in New England, they are quite involved in this conflict. Right, so here, of course, you see your elite, top of the top, but you do see a lot of these more middle-class type individuals or middling individuals who are involved as patriots from pretty early on.
Crisis comes to a head in Massachusetts. Boston has been a hotbed of patriot activity since the Stamp Act. And tension rises when British soldiers are quartered here in 1768. On the 5th of March, 1770, an altercation between soldiers and locals turns into a tense standoff. Taunted by an angry crowd, hundreds strong, pelted with snowballs and rocks, the small British detachment loses its nerve and opens fire.
Yeah.
Five local men are killed. The Boston Massacre, as it becomes known, is powerful propaganda for the patriot cause.
Yeah, I mean, this is a massive event in the lead up to revolution, right? For a variety of different reasons. First of all, this is this sort of almost archetypical moment that you see in so many revolutions, where you've got a line of soldiers and a crowd. And the crowd is angry, they're pushing, they're throwing things. And what always happens in these types of situations? Someone fires. And then what do you have? You've got a massacre on your hands. right? So we see this exact instant play out many times throughout history. I will say this whole thing is a big reason why we have our Third Amendment today to prevent the quartering of soldiers. But along with being this big event, it's also very powerful propaganda, right? I mean, Paul Revere is very much involved in spreading that propaganda, right? I'm sure it doesn't take much to imagine why this would be effective propaganda, right? You can say you have this, it wasn't entirely peaceful, but how you're going to frame it is a peaceful protest of good, loyal citizens, protesting against these tyrannical policies. And what happens? The soldiers fire into the crowd. I mean, the story writes itself, right? So this gets people really riled up.
The news carried in pamphlets and prints, the most famous created by Paul Revere.
Yep.
Blood has been spilt. Emotions are running high.
Let the 5th of March never be forgot,
writes Bostonian Samuel Savage in his diary. Many anticipate a downward spiral into violence and disorder.
Yeah. The inhabitants are greatly enraged, and not without reason. Yeah.
Despite the bloodshed in Boston, there are many on both sides who seek to de-escalate the crisis between British, Loyalists and Patriots. The British governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, withdraws the troops from Boston.
Right. At this point, well, first of all, almost no one is using the I word, independence. Still way, way too early. Most of the people involved still see themselves as loyal British subjects. However, there is an incredibly high amount of tension, right? The streets of Boston are up in arms. People are furious, and they are ready for violence. You have this increasingly radical faction of patriots who wants essentially direct resistance to the British Parliament and these British soldiers, right? So the tension's getting higher and higher and higher, but, once again, still a little early for independence from the vast, vast majority, and you still have a lot of people who are trying to de-escalate, right? Whether you're more inclined toward the patriot cause or the loyalist cause, people are like, whoa, let's tone it down a little bit.
And has those involved in the shooting put on trial. They are acquitted of murder thanks to the efforts of their skilled lawyer, a noted patriot, John Adams.
It's a sort of a moment where John Adams is like, I'll step up to my principles. He's someone who believes in a free and fair trial. He's a patriot, but he says, you know what? I'll represent these guys. It's like, all right, John, okay. You're really a principled individual.
In Britain, there is a new Prime Minister, Lord North. A close friend of the King and staunch advocate of parliamentary authority, he will serve in the role for the next 12 years. The economic damage of colonial boycotts persuades him to repeal Townshend's new taxes. All but one, on tea. Relative calm returns to the colonies.
So once again, you see this situation where the taxes are put in place, everyone gets super mad, a big conflagration happens, they mostly or all get repealed, right? So Parliament steps up and it steps down. But each time this happens, people get more and more angry and more mobilized and radical and political, right? So when the next issue comes, people are even more ready to fight. And though Parliament has sort of been stepping down, backing off, they're still not backing off their absolute authority to impose these taxes, right? And so they're still holding that line.
The boycott is lifted. A second crisis has been weathered. But in New England, hostility towards the British government lingers.
Yeah.
Here, local merchants rely on ships and trade, and have long resented British imperial rules, which restrict their commerce with other nations.
Like I said, being a merchant often also meant being a smuggler, right? And for a long time, especially when Britain hasn't been paying much attention, people are ignoring those rules and trading with the French and the Spanish and etc.
Many patriots, like John Hancock, make extra money by smuggling goods into the colonies, bypassing British import duties. British efforts to clamp down on smuggling do not make them any more popular.
No.
Royal Navy warships are used to inspect and seize vessels belonging to prominent local figures, like John Hancock. To the outrage of New England merchants, the British also begin trying suspected smugglers in special Vice Admiralty courts, rather than the more sympathetic local courts.
Right, because that's exactly it. The more sympathetic local courts, because they know if they charge these people in local courts, they're probably going to get off without much punishment. Now, Britain here is trying to enforce its policy, but you can imagine how this makes the people outraged. Because, first of all, this smuggling's been happening for a very long time. And for most of that time, Britain has not super strongly been enforcing the restrictions on smuggling, though they have to a certain extent. That's absolutely true. They never liked smuggling. I don't want to misrepresent that. Now that enforcement is ramping up, and up. People already don't like that. It's a further restriction on what they can and can't do. And now, when they catch these pretty respectable merchants smuggling, instead of trying them in a regular court, they bring them to a Vice Admiralty court. This is seen as quite outrageous. They say you don't even want to properly try people within the bounds of the law. You want to take them out just so you can punish them more harshly. Right? So once again, people are getting angrier and more radicalized.
In 1772, the Sons of Liberty hit back, boarding the Royal Navy schooner HMS Gaspé and setting it ablaze. Meanwhile, in Britain, the Empire's largest corporation is on the verge of bankruptcy. The East India Company has a monopoly on British trade with India, China, and the East Indies. But a credit crisis now threatens its survival.
That's how a lot of these corporations initially form in this era of exploration and imperialism, right? They're essentially these corporations that have been founded to have monopolies on trade with particular places or trade of particular items, right? These are essentially corporations that have control over particular monopolies, usually granted to them by the crown of their respective country. Now, a lot of these corporations, as we head into the late 1700s, into the 1800s, they're sort of going to have to either adapt to this new era that's coming, or they're going to fall apart.
In 1773, to help keep the company afloat, Parliament grants it the right to sell tea directly to the American colonies. The company also receives tariff exemptions that will make its tea cheaper than that of the local smugglers.
Yeah.
But a small tax of 3 pence per pound of tea remains in place. The new Tea Act thus threatens the profits of local smugglers and provokes patriots on the principle of taxation without representation.
And of course, as I think I've mentioned a couple of times, especially up in New England, many of your most devoted patriots are these usually middle class and or upper class type of merchants, right? And they're the ones being hit by this.
As 7 company ships cross the Atlantic, packed with 250 tons of tea, the Sons of Liberty and others pressure tea dealers to reject the shipments. When one ship...
Yeah, and that pressure could, it wasn't just pressure, could sometimes be more direct intervention.
...arrives in Philadelphia, thousands of locals threaten anyone who helps to unload its cargo.
That's right.
Most of the ships are forced to turn back. In Boston, however, Governor Thomas Hutchinson has had enough of boycotts. He ensures that 3 company ships enter the harbor.
Uh-oh. Surely this will all go well. The other ships in these other cities like Philadelphia, they've been turned back. They did not want to deal with the smoke that the colonists had for them. Well, up here in Boston, Hutchinson's like, I'm done with all of this boycotting and this rioting in the streets. I'm gonna have order. Okay, well, we'll see how that works out.
On a December evening in 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty board the ships, disguised as Native Americans.
Yeah.
They've chosen these costumes as a symbol of their new American identity.
Yeah, it's an interesting decision. I mean, there's a lot to be said, not to get too much into it now, because there will be chances to talk about it throughout this series, but of sort of the hypocrisy of a lot of these causes, right? These colonists are outraged against the British, and they talk of oppression and slavery and all that sort of stuff, while a lot of these colonists, up here in the North, many of them aren't super in favor of slavery, but a lot of these colonists either don't care about or are in favor of slavery. And one of the issues that will separate a lot of these colonists from the British government is that these American colonists want to keep pushing the indigenous people out of their territory, whereas at times, not always, but at times, the British government is like, okay, hold back a little bit. So some of the language here and the symbols taken are, pretty much dripping in hypocrisy, but,
They break open 340 chests of tea and dump the contents into the harbor. 92,000 pounds of tea in all, with a value today of nearly $2 million.
Damn.
Patriots celebrate the Boston Tea Party as a bold act of defiance. And it is just the most famous of several such acts in numerous ports and towns. According to Patriot lawyer John Adams,
this is the most magnificent movement of all. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the Patriots that I greatly admire. The people should never rise without doing something to be remembered, something notable and striking.
the reaction in London is rather different.
Yeah.
The British government sees only lawlessness, mob rule, and an outrageous attack on private property. Enough is enough. If the government does not act firmly now, its authority in North America will lie in tatters.
But it turns out that if they do act now, their authority will be non-existent. But obviously, no one here can see the future, right? You have this continued escalation. And, I mean, what would have been the right response from the British Parliament? It's sort of hard to say. They're sort of doing this dance of, well, we go in with the authority, and then we back off, and then we go in. Now, I can tell you that definitely wasn't the move. But, of course, from their perspective, they feel, well, if we just completely back off, what are the point of these even being our colonies? We have no control over them, so we have to assert our authority. But, of course, in retrospect, we know that by asserting their authority, they're going to lead to the exact revolution and then independence that they are trying to avoid.
The time for restraint is over. The gloves are coming off.
Whoa.
Today, there are probably more original, high-quality history documentaries being made than at any time in history.
An ad?
Yet at the same time, it's getting harder and harder to find the good ones amidst the flood of derivatives.
There we go.
40% off.
So there's their ad for Nebula. So I'll leave their video linked down below. You can go check it out. And you absolutely should, right? I say this with all of these videos, but especially the newer ones. Go and check out Epic History's video. Absolutely watch it on your own. Leave a like, subscribe, go check out their sponsor. We want to show them support for making this fantastic content, right? Epic History, they've got a couple new series up recently. This one on the American Revolution, the one on 20th century China, which I reacted to recently. So I'm really enjoying all this new content. Epic History always does a fantastic job with this sort of stuff, and I love to see them taking on these new topics, right? It's always good to see a new Epic History video. You know you're in for something good. So, we're done with our first episode of the American Revolution. We sort of saw the build-up to rebellion, the road to rebellion, as the title says. You know, everything is beginning to get very tense. Violence has already broken out, and we're only going to see more violence in the episodes to come. So yeah, I'm excited to continue this series. If you guys enjoyed this one, you could leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With that, I hope you guys are all having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.